Air Marshal Greg Bagwell, great pleasure to have you back with us again. Former Deputy Commander of the Royal Air Force, now boss of the Air and Space Power Association. Great pleasure. Thanks very much for coming back in. Lots to cover today. I'd like to start, though, by going straight into Ukraine. The breaking news over the last few days, exactly when we're not sure, is that F-16s have arrived. And we've had President Zelensky stood in front of a couple of F-16s, partially camouflaged. So loads of questions around this, but let me start by just going, will they actually make a difference? How are they going to be used? What's your assessment of Russia quaking their boots or looking for target practice?
Yeah, thanks, Sean and Bern, for bringing me back. It's always a pleasure. It's been an interesting week, actually, because obviously this was heralded for, well, let's be honest, almost years, but certainly months. And finally now we believe they're in country, but the camouflage, pixelated pictures et al., they're not going to advertise exactly where they are or what they're doing. We believe it's small numbers, a dozen or 10 or so, and that's hardly surprising at this stage, partly limited by the number of pilots. And a lot of people speculating about what type were they, where have they come from, what weapons have they got, etc. I don't think we should play that game here. I think let's let the Russians find out for themselves. But from what I can gather and from what's being said, those are high upgrade versions of an F-16. So these are not off the scrap heap. These are aeroplanes that have been modified up to the point.
I think what's interesting about that, though, I agree with you. It's not worth, but I do think you and I have flown aeroplanes that may have been relatively old at times, but it wasn't the airframe, it was the software, wasn't it? So things like defensive aids, it may just be a switch in the cockpit, but there's a lot of technology in that. The radar, your countermeasures, and particularly if they're going to be used in an air-to-air role at all, which seems like it's likely, what model of stick that the Americans are going to let them have. Now, I don't want to speculate, but if they're to be credible on the front line, they're going to need to have a relatively modern upgrade version of the F-16 to be credible, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one of the things I always get a little frustrated about is that a lot of people go to air shows, see high-performance aeroplanes doing very clever tricks. It's not really about that anymore. The performance of the aircraft has a place, but it is about the systems. The sensors on the aircraft, the radar. We can't see what radar it's got in there, but I'm hoping it's a relatively advanced version, hopefully an electronically scanned one, and also the electronic warfare capabilities, its ability to both defeat and seduce other systems. Those will be what make the F-16 in that theatre a potential game changer. But let's just explore the word game changer. I mean, 10 aeroplanes are not going to shift the needle much.
Because Zelensky's been asking for about 160, hasn't he?
Yeah.
I think it's about 80 or 90 have been committed so far. But as you said, pilot numbers, they're not going to deliver enough pilots to fly those for years.
Yeah, if you add up all the offers from the various nations, then you can get to around 70 or 80 aircraft. You and I know that that's never the number you operate. You'll operate a smaller number than that. Some of those will be in reserve and used for maintenance, etc. So, and then a cruise will actually be the limiting factor for now. We've only seen a handful of crews. That will increase over time and eventually become self-sustaining because they'll be able to train their own crews. But that's going to take a long time. And that's not the sort of thing you want to do while you're in the middle of a war, let's be honest. I think the numbers are going to be an issue. Now, why would Zelensky say he needs a certain number? When you look at the size of Ukraine and just put a little map of the UK inside Ukraine, we're talking about a very large area. And to be able to cover all that area, you're going to need a lot of airplanes. He's got less than you would have had at Biggin Hill in the Battle of Britain. We're asking him to cover the whole of 10 times the UK. So if you're just looking at sheer numbers, they need a lot more. Those aren't going to happen for a long time. So what he's going to have to do, or what the Air Force are going to have to do, is integrate those in the current system, including all the other air defence systems that are on the ground, and use the F-16 quite cleverly to plug the gaps. I think a lot of the Russian attacks are quite predictable. They're coming on pretty predictable axes of attack, so and against particular targets. So I think there is a way that they can employ them to the maximum.
And do you think, so one of the things that Zelensky's talked very openly about is that the Russian glide bombs are causing havoc, something like 3,000 bombs, and because the Russians can launch them from a long way back, 40 or 50 kilometers back from the front line, but the only way to do that is to launch them from very high. That makes you relatively vulnerable. he implied that that's how the F-16s were going to be used to try to combat that threat. Intellectually, I struggled a bit with that. What's your take on how you think they're going to be used?
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting how they do it. And if it was me, and I think I've said this previously, I'd almost be using them as sort of guerrilla tactics. In other words, pick a particular moment in time and create a spectacular event, rather than try and sustain a 24/7 air defence, which you're never going to do with 10 aircraft. You wouldn't even do it over a limited piece of sky. So they're going to have to look at some spectaculars. And let's be honest, if they can have one success against an A-50 or against a Su-34 that's doing one of these glide bomb attacks, and they do it with a bit of surprise, maybe in a month's time, not today, not tomorrow, then they might just put sort of a little bit of fear in the Russian Air Force's minds and change the calculus. And that's the game to play here. Can they do something spectacular that then begins to put a doubt and sows the seed of concern within the pilots?
But if you were the head of the Russian Air Force...
Heaven forbid. Yep.
Yeah, and you saw a small handful of these 1990s generation aircraft, you'd go, right, and by all accounts, Putin has said the first guy shoots one down, 15 million rubles, which is about £150,000, I think. But it's basically King's fortune.
Yeah.
They know where all the airfields are, all the Ukrainian airfields are. They've got satellite technology to watch all this stuff.
Yeah.
How on earth does Ukraine avoid just having these things schwacked before they even get airborne?
I look at this from a different perspective. So if he's already putting a ransom on the head of an F-16, I mean, that clearly means he's a bit worried, because he hasn't put that on anything else. So why are the F-16s bothering him so much?
Well, he did it for tanks as well, didn't he?
Okay, maybe.
He did it for, I think, Challenger 2s.
Was it a bit less money, though, was it?
It wasn't 15.
So he's obviously concerned about it. So that in itself tells you everything. In fact, there was some strikes just the other day, on the same day that Zelensky did his press review, that there were some Russian channels saying, oh, that strike must have been an F-16. So it's already got inside their heads. So that's not a bad thing. And if some hotshot Russian pilot wants to charge into Ukraine, try and capture an F-16, good. Because I would put my money on the F-16, quite frankly. And I think that's the issue here. Yes, it is a 1990s aircraft on paper. In fact, it's 50 years old, the F-16, from its original start. But these are not old aeroplanes. These have got brand new systems on. If they've got the data links and the information that they need and see these aircraft coming, and let's be honest, the Russian success rate over the border of their aircraft has not been good. So I think they will be, if I can use this phrase on your podcast, shit scared of an F-16. I think the reason they'll be really quite nervous is, up until now, they've been up against Russian aircraft. So they know the electronic signature. They know how they fight. They taught them. They learned from each other. So they know how to fight another MiG or another Sukhoi. They've never been up against an F-16. They're not easy. I've done combat against F-16. I'm sure you have too. They're tiny, so they're hard to pick up on radar. They're manoeuvrable. They're small to see with a naked eye as well. And if those have got the long-range missiles that I think they've got, they're going to be a handful.
And any plane takes 20 years to bring out anyway. So if it's 20 years old, it's brand new. So 30 years old or whatever actually doesn't seem that long a time.
I think you're making an argument there for us, Bernard.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're right. And sometimes it takes 20 years for aeroplanes to be matured enough. And what's happened to the F-16 over the last 20, 30 years is that the new sensors, the new systems, those aeroplanes are as advanced in that sense as the airplane coming off a production line today. And let's be honest here, F-16s are still coming off the production line and are still in service, even in NATO, as a frontline aircraft. So, yeah, let's not downplay the F-16. It's not the most modern aircraft, but it's right up there.
And what about all the other stuff? So you got one plane, one pilot, and then you've got a couple of hundred people on the ground supporting it, plus all the other systems. So how has all that been delivered and put into action as well?
Yeah, we don't see as much detail on that. And if you go back, the arguments that I was having with other people that this could never be done, it was all too difficult. Well, that was 2 years ago. So we've taken a long time to get to today. That's a long time to train ground crew, to buy the right ancillary equipment. And I don't know how much this is progressing, but I've seen Ukraine advertising for people to come and help. And other nations will have to make their choices about what that means for them as nationalists, a national from one country helping another. So there'll be plenty of expertise, and it's a lot easier getting a trained F-16 engineer to come and work in Ukraine than maybe someone to sit in the cockpit and fly the aeroplane. And some of the maintenance can be done elsewhere. If they get up to 50, 60, 70 aeroplanes, I wouldn't put all of them in Ukraine. I'd keep quite a large number of them back in safe places, which I know Russia will threaten, but that will be a hollow threat. So there are lots of ways of doing this, but they do still need to be trained on how to manage them, how to maintain them. But these modern aeroplanes now, it's box in, box out type stuff. It's not spanner and screwdrivers.
But what about things like the F-16 famously, because its intake is a chin underneath the nose, isn't it? It's a Hoover. A lot of people describe it as a Hoover.
Yeah.
So the Americans and all the operators of the F-16 have to be scrupulous about getting foreign object damage off the runways and stuff like that.
Yeah.
There's a lot of crap around on airfields in Ukraine at the moment, and most of the Soviet era kit is much more robust. It's got intakes high up. Do you think the environment in Ukraine might actually be quite difficult for the F-16 to be operating in?
It was always a factor. There's two things with the F-16 actually that are quite critical on landing, and if you look at the photographs of it, you can see why. They've got a very narrow undercarriage. So crosswind limits are an issue for the F-16. I think it's about 20 knots. So it does skip a little bit on runways. So the runways need to be quite even. You don't want to go operating these off uneven runways or in high crosswinds. And as you say, the intake is right underneath the aeroplane. And therefore, if you ever see them taxi, you'll see videos of little vortexes being sucked into the intake of water off the runway. So they will pick up what's known as foreign object damage, little stones or whatever. So yeah, your runway sweeper will be busy. It'll need to keep those runways clear.
But also, if Russians are attacked, because over the last few weeks there have been a lot of attacks against Ukrainian airfields, it appears in anticipation. We did a piece the other day about the ghost army from the World War II and creating these models of aircraft. And because there was a bit in the news about Ukraine had lost 5 aircraft one day, and the head of the Ukrainian Air Force said, before you jump to conclusions, we are setting up lots of models here. And you went, okay, I wonder what the truth behind that is.
Well, we saw the Serbs do that, of course.
Yeah.
You'll have personal experience of that. And putting out decoys is a very clever way. And let's be brutal here. Whether the F-16 does or doesn't have an immediate impact in the air, it will have an impact on the ground. Because if the Russians are now playing a shell game with Ukraine of trying to find these 10 F-16s and wasting time, energy and weapons chasing them, those are weapons not being fired at other things in Ukraine.
Last time you were with us, Greg, you said one of the side effects, I can say advantages, but side effect of the war between Russia and Ukraine is that we've seen Russia up close and personal. We've had a good look at all their equipment. They're obviously putting their best foot forward. And therefore we've seen actually how in many cases how weak they are. Yeah. They seemed a much bigger threat, when we weren't seeing them. Now we are seeing them, we're sort of less afraid. You mentioned something about the systems on the F-16 and radar in particular. Could you give us some insight into, in particular what we're seeing now? What makes a winning bit of radar? And what makes a losing bit of radar? In other words, what sort of advantages could we actually see?
Okay. Well, coming back to your first point about Russia's now putting their best foot forward. I mean, if they are, it ain't great. Right. So that's the first observation I'd make. I mean, we're not seeing the detail. I mean, there will be some detail. And from what I've been told by others who have seen the detail, there's a lot more going on than we're aware of, particularly in the electromagnetic spectrum. That is a bit of an invisible world that we're not really seeing what's happening. I can assure you that right now, that battle space will be absolutely saturated with trons going backwards and forwards, countermeasures, measures, all of which plays back into your discussion about the radar. We didn't see them employ some of these strategic bombs, strategic bombers, cruise missiles. They've only got so many stocks. So actually Russia really didn't want to win Ukraine at any cost, because it always knew that NATO was next in line, if you like. So or whatever else they had on their to-do list. So they would not have wanted to use all their high-priced toys, and certainly wouldn't want to use all their ammunition stocks. They are now doing that, and they're now struggling to resupply that. So we're seeing their most modern aircraft, their most modern weapons being employed, and they're not having that great an effect. They're either being intercepted or being kept at arm's length. So that would be a worry for Russia for 2 reasons. It means their kit isn't as good as they think it was. All this talk about wonder hypersonic weapons, well, they're getting shot out of the sky by a Patriot system that is 20, 30 years old. their S-300, S-400 air defense systems that apparently were death ray laser beams are being slowly but surely knocked out of the ground by long-range missiles that they aren't able to intercept. So actually there's a lot of things here that tell us Russia isn't as good as they think they are. That will be a concern for Russia in terms of winning wars. And if you're right now an export customer of Russia, you'll be looking and going, that isn't quite what you told me it could do. So they'll be concerned on both levels. So coming back to the F-16, so if the world that they're going to operate in is highly saturated with jamming and counter jamming, you're going to want a radar that can penetrate through that. Now, an actively scanned radar is effectively electronic radar. It doesn't actually move. It just sits there. It's a solid state, basically. Is much more able to break through that electromagnetic spectrum far more cleverly, and in itself exploit the spectrum to jam other systems. So it's not just a radar. It's also a sensor, and it's also, to a degree, a weapon. It can jam other systems. So if you are an F-16 versus an Su-34, 100 miles apart, pointing at each other, the first thing is who sees who's first. So that's the first trick. Well, an actively scanned radar is able to do that by detecting the signal, not just by sensing you. So it does it through different means. Then the question is who can get the first firing shot, and then who can then guide that weapon onto the other target for the longest, and then be the furthest away when the weapon hits that target. And that's where the real game will take place. I use the word game that fighter pilots tend to talk about as a game. It's a deadly serious fight. But the one who can win that electronic battle of wits and fire their weapon first and the furthest and the fastest will win in that combat. And that's where the sensors and the systems that the F-16 possesses will absolutely be part of that equation.
It's also one of the complications, isn't it? Because I'm not sure will they have data link? And the aircraft will definitely have data link.
Let's not say how it might get used, but I would be amazed if they were not being fed as good an air picture as possible. So I would expect an F-16 flying in Ukraine now to be able to get airborne, switch its data link on without turning on its radar, and get a perfect air picture.
And that's important because if you put a radar on, you are effectively...
You're beakening, you're showing the other side
you're
that you're
waving,
in the air.
Here I am.
So if you're effectively silent but only taking in information, you can actually target that aircraft that someone else has seen on your behalf.
Yeah, sure.
And only when the weapon is fired, and even then they might not get a signal, they know they're even being targeted. And if they can't bring their A-50s forward and they haven't got a data link system, the advantage is going to be in the Ukraine's hands. And if you go back to the Battle of Britain, it's not a great historical comparison, but the reason we were able to prevail in the Battle of Britain is we had less far to go. We could get airborne out of Biggin Hill and attack a target coming over the coast. We had our radar, we had our observers. All the advantage was on the defender's side. That's exactly the situation you'll be in Ukraine. And as soon as you start to put your airplane over Ukraine border, and you know that the people down there have got pitchforks and rifles, you start getting a bit more nervous.
So as you were saying earlier, the very existence of them is going to make you very, very cautious.
Definitely.
You don't want to...
And they won't have trained against a Western system.
No.
They won't know what it's like to be targeted by a weapon system that goes active without any radar signal, that's purely through data link, that they won't be able to get inside. All of those will be a factor.
And in a previous show, Sean mentioned that some of the technology's got the ability to ghost yourself, sort of reposition where you are. You're actually here, but you're telling your attacker that actually I'm over there and I'm not.
Yeah, particularly a system that uses a radar, so effectively a raw radar return that needs to target you and then fire a missile at you, particularly the surface-to-air missile systems. You've got jamming systems that effectively lie to the system shooting at you where you are. So they decoy the missile to go somewhere else.
It doesn't have to miss by much, that's the thing.
Not quite,
Because most of these missiles, they look pretty big, but most of that's propellant and get you there. The actual explosive charge is relatively small.
So it's got to be close.
So it's got to be pretty close to actually do the damage.
I mean, we were off on a tangent here, but they're called missiles for a reason. They don't hit you, actually. They do miss, but they have a fuse that creates an explosion near you.
That's right, yeah.
So all you've got to do is create a miss distance of 30, 40 feet.
Yeah.
And suddenly you get away with it. Now everyone says, but these weapons do Mach 6. Yeah, okay, they do. But have you tried to turn a rocket at Mach 6? It doesn't turn very quick.
No. And that's the thing about the Mach 6, which is lovely, because you get into the whole business about it's really fast rocket, but the rocket has to go where it thinks you're going to be. So I'm going along like this. I'm going to be here when the intercept, so the rocket fires at that. So if I now turn my aircraft to that, like that, the point I'm going to be at intercept is now up there. So this rocket has now got to turn that corner to point up there. Now I pull that down, and you create a solution that this Mark 6 rocket just cannot turn fast enough to react.
Can I just make an important point here? If we were in a bar, Sean would
I'd have to buy a lot of beer now.
For getting hands in the bar.
Oh yeah, he does that a lot actually.
Yeah, I bet he does.
Yeah, yeah.
I bet he doesn't pay for his round though.
Nothing's changed. Nothing's changed.
Come to think of it, I just
Stop it. So just stepping back from the F-16 just for a second though, over the last few months, over the summer, Russia has been on the front foot.
Yeah.
And there's lots of reasons behind that. Delays in American weapons, Western weapons, but predominantly US weapons. Those weapons are now flowing into, but we're still seeing all the well on the front line, Russia on the front foot. Have they made a strategically important breakthrough? No. Are they still, though, grinding their way forward? Yes. It feels like we're slipping further and further away from a position where Ukraine might prevail at some stage, and therefore inexorably to some sort of compromise. What's your take on how this is playing out?
I think those are all fair observations. I mean, what we're seeing ultimately is the mass of the Russian capability that is slowly but surely grinding away. Massive casualties. I mean, 1,000 casualties a day. We took 500 casualties during the entire Afghan campaign, and they are seeing 1,000 a day. So let's not. Russia aren't getting away with this, and I'm not sure how long they can sustain either the materiel or the men that they are losing in this war. But they are grinding their way inch by inch a little bit further each day. You're right to highlight the fact that weapons were a bit slow in coming. Actually, my concern hasn't been the delivery of the weapons per se. That is an issue. It's the permissions that we have not given to the use of those weapons. Had we allowed Ukraine, which we should have done right from the get-go, to use those weapons against deeper targets within Russia itself, I don't think we'd have seen the gains that we've seen by Russia. So our restrictions on the Ukraine's use of those weapons, I think, has been instrumental in allowing Russia to gain a little bit of an upper hand.
But I wonder how many other things do you think that the West could be doing now, but because of the rhetoric around nuclear weapons and Putin constantly shaking that saber rattling.
Yeah.
Because actually, I agree with you entirely. You look back 2 years, we were barely happy to provide anti-tank weapons.
Yeah.
Then we said, oh, okay, but we can't provide tanks. Then we did provide tanks. Then we can't provide long-range missiles. Then we did. And all of that was because we were nervous about what Putin might actually do. What have we learned from that, and what else should we be doing?
Well, I'll tell you what I've learned. Whether other politicians have learned at the same time, we'll have to wait and see. I mean, what we've been watching is deterrence at work. We've seen Russia using language or rhetoric that has deterred a number of things over the last 2 years. And I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, was that deterrent credible? We've stepped now over a number of red lines. If you give them tanks, we will attack NATO. If you give them anti-tank weapons, we'll attack NATO. If you give them MiG-29s, if you give them F-16s, every single time we've stepped over that alleged red line and nothing has happened. Actually, things have happened. We've probably seen attacks in our nations that we haven't yet joined the dots up to. But Russia is acting. It's just acting in a different way. So I think I cannot buy the argument that allowing them to strike within Ukraine is counter to the rules of self-defense. And right now, Ukraine are operating under the UN Charter, which allows you to use the inherent right of self-defense. If someone is about to attack you from 30 kilometers away or launch an aircraft strike from 100 kilometers away, and you strike it before it does that, that's self-defense.
Jumping up even further back, there's been a lot of talk, obviously, about the American election coming up, particularly Kamala Harris and Biden. Yeah. There's still a lot of talk about potentially Trump taking over and the shockwaves that might have for A, NATO, but B, the war in Ukraine. Famously, Trump sort of talking about there's a deal to be done, and potentially very uncomfortably for Zelensky calling a halt. What's your take on that?
Yeah, well, we probably can't do American politics in one podcast, but let's wait and see how that turns out. But if let's say it was to be a Trump victory, the sort of language he's been using is very much playing into the sort of offer that Putin allegedly is putting on the table. But that offer is effectively to freeze where everyone is now and for Ukraine effectively to give up those 4 regions. So not just Crimea now, but also a landline all the way in from Russia into Crimea. So Putin would take that as a victory. And quite frankly, if he could have achieved that in the first week or two, he'd have absolutely accepted that. Now, whether that's where he ultimately wanted to be or not, we'll perhaps never know. But I think anything that plays into those hands now is effectively a defeat. But
however you play that, if the answer looks increasingly unlikely that Ukraine will be able to liberate all of its territory, if therefore the war will only end with some form of compromise, there's been some really interesting senior voices saying, but if you let that happen, in the short term, it's great because we bring the war to an end, but you reward aggression. And Putin will have won. What message does that send to people like Xi Jinping in China, Taiwan, maybe Iran, maybe North Korea? And therefore, is that actually a really worrying outcome for global security? Short-term palliative, yes, it stops the fighting in Ukraine, but actually that marks a really worrying trend for global security.
You need to look at this through so many different prisms. Let's just look at it through Ukraine's as a starter for 10. There could be an argument that said if Ukraine's options are eventually a complete takeover from Russia or hold the line where it is now and just cede that region, then you might be able to make an argument that says, you know what, there's no way out of this. We're going to have to take the unpalatable truth. I'm not sure Ukraine are up for that in any way, shape or form. And quite frankly, they shouldn't be. But when you look at it from a wider deterrent perspective, what message does that send to Russia? That, oh, okay, so we can get that bit. Okay, it was painful, but we've got that bit. Right, what's next? Baltic states? Scandinavian states? Other regions of the world? And if they can continue to sow discord within Europe, between NATO, if America decides to distance itself, you can see how this then becomes far more serious. And there's no evidence to suggest that Russia will stop here. They haven't any other time. Why would they stop this time? So, yeah, this idea that we can create peace tomorrow and everything goes away and everything goes back in the box as if it never happened, I think we're too far gone. I think also we need to remember that the average Russian has been told a story in Ukraine. And somebody once said this to me, that there are now mothers and widows in Russia singing another decade of songs about how their sons and daughters died in Ukraine. And they're going to resent this. And the idea, therefore, that this is all going to be packaged up as nothing really happened, I think you're going to see the aftermath of the thousands and thousands of casualties and what that then means for the Russian psyche and how they view the West, how they view Ukraine. And who's to say that they won't then put a puppet in place in Ukraine who then suddenly shifts the other way? That's how it was done the last time. And we'll be back where we started.
I've heard that story. So you're two military guys, and it's completely understandable. I'd probably go along with it, what you said about it being absolute disaster. But I've heard so many stories to shade it in so many different ways as well. And so it's very hard to know what to believe. And I think there are, as you've said, Greg, there are other dimensions to this, which I think you have to take into account as opposed to the sort of territory gain, territory loss. So there's a chap called Jackson Hinkle, who's an American social media influencer. He's been accused of being a bit of a Putin apologist. Whether that's totally true or whether people just don't like him being active on the subject, I'm not sure. He's dug up a whole load of information and films on the Donbass region. And what Putin has done is basically, whether he's ethnically cleansed or not, I'm not entirely sure. Not sure anybody is, but what he certainly has done, he started to rebuild the area. I mean, 600 lorries full of infrastructure on the streets, new flats, new houses, new industries. They're putting stuff up a week at a time. It would take America 5 years to get through planning regs to do what they're doing. So he's obviously in full lockdown mode to convince these areas that it's good to still be a part of Russia or be a part of Russia in the future. All that stuff would have to be overcome as well. So it's not as simple as saying, if we let him keep this, then he'll go for another bit. What do you think?
Yeah, look, I'm the first person to admit that the internal politics around that particular region of the world are very complex and go back
A long way.
decades, if not hundreds of years, as they do in the entire region. So you can pick a point in history where you can say, okay, where's the point that you go back to? But what he's doing is effectively a form of genocide. I mean, by moving out certain types of people or forcing them out, by kidnapping children and bringing them to Russia and giving them Russian families to be adopted by, and then going in and building new cities that you then pay Russians to come and relocate into because it's a cheap housing. That is effectively a form of euthanasia.
Yeah, but is it? And it's terrible. But is it a factor when you come to think? How do we readopt that?
Of course, it's a factor. I mean, goodness knows how you would readopt basically the fact that someone's actually physically moved the border.
We had Andrew Fox here last week, wasn't it? And he turned around. His take was, even if Ukraine could take it back, it's shark-infested custard now. And actually, therefore, they might be better off because of what Russia's done. They might be better off just drawing a line and saying, actually, that's it.
If you wanted to play out a scenario, and I'm making this up as I go along a little bit, but if you were to create a buffer zone that included those 4 regions and both militaries backed out of it, and then you put UN observers in that region, as we have done in so many other places in the world, Lebanon, Cyprus, people are still there 40, 50, 60 years later, then you could see a way that maybe over time you could begin to normalise that part of the world, because you don't just start moving borders, 100 miles left and right and everything's solved. And how many nations and countries do we know that struggle with people artificially drawing borders? We've probably been guilty of it over the years. So I think you are not talking about just a status quo ante where you just put everything back to where it was, but you are talking potentially about creating a neutral zone where you allow something to try and fix the void.
I guess the point is, if you do that, Russia doesn't get punished. And people talk about sanctions, but Byrne made the point last week. Yeah, they're not able to sell oil to the West, but actually all they're doing is selling it to somebody else, and we're buying it, and we're buying from them.
You're right; they might not be punished, but if Russia was forced to go back to the previous border and wasn't allowed to encroach, didn't have a landline to Crimea, I would argue that Russia hasn't won. But you're right; it might not have lost either, and I think maybe that's where the compromise is going to have to come in. We shouldn't forget Putin is still on a list to go to the International Court of Justice.
Yeah, but it's very unlikely we're ever going to see.
Well, he's not. I doubt whether he's going to travel to a country and find out.
No. But and I guess the other part of this is,
let's be honest, others have, and they have been tried, and they are in jail.
They were more isolationist. But I guess the other final bit from me on this is the role of NATO. I mean, even in the King's speech, Byrne brought it up the other day. That the government has said, we want to try to rush Ukraine into NATO.
They will play a leading
role.
King Charles said, "My government will play a leading role to get Ukraine into NATO."
And you sort of feel that Putin doesn't want to have NATO on its doorstep. Almost certainly a negotiating chip will be that to rush Ukraine in might actually prolong the war, because Putin might well go, right, I can't accept Ukraine being in NATO, so I'm going to continue fighting until they can't do that. What's your take on that?
Well, the first thing to note here is that Russia's already blown it if its job was to distance NATO, because Finland and Sweden have now got him surrounded, and every other nation is now more keen to remain a member of NATO than they've ever been. So Putin has done a lot to strengthen NATO's resolve here. The argument about whether Ukraine could or couldn't join NATO, I mean, there are all sorts of reasons why it will struggle to join now or even in the near future. NATO would never, and in fact is written in the Charter, would never take a nation on that is involved in an ongoing dispute, particularly with Russia, because obviously the complications of that and an Article 5. So it would have to be something that would happen over time. I know there are people that argue that it's NATO expansionism that's caused this in the first place. There are quite some famous people who've done that. I mean, NATO is a voluntary organisation and a defensive alliance. People join it because they're frightened of the alternative, not because they want to attack Russia. Unfortunately, Russia is making it harder and harder for that to not be an outcome because of the way they're acting. But at the moment, asking a nation to join a defensive alliance is perfectly sensible when you're the one on the front line. Which is exactly where Ukraine are. And we shouldn't forget that we all signed a memorandum in Budapest that said we would all look after Ukraine. Yes, it was going to take away its nuclear weapons, but none of us would try and cause any trouble, and we'd all act to safeguard Ukraine. Well, that wasn't worth the paper it's written on, which is why you can understand why Ukraine is saying, well, I don't like your memorandums. They're not very useful. I want the assurance of an Article 5. I've got the assurance of the UN Charter. You've all said, in fact, the majority in the UN said, this is wrong. Russia must get out, but nothing's happened.
Yeah, but you're touching there on an interesting debate about whether these international institutions have actually run out of road. We've got the irony now that UN Security Council, which only exists to promote
shared
peace.
by Russia.
Correct. How does that happen?
The good news is that still allows, therefore, Article 51 to be applied, because until the Security Council resolves it, Ukraine continue to be able to use the inherent right of collective self-defense.
But the point is, I think that the danger is with potentially more US isolationists and potentially, NATO. I inevitably, like you, buy into the whole argument as a defensive alliance. But there are those that say that there were various agreements done with US presidents that said that this is as far as NATO will go. Yeah. And if you are Russia, you'll see the inexorable march of NATO to your doorstep. And that seems to have led to the potential where Russia is trying to form, whether it's BRICS or whether it's military alliances with North Korea, Iran, an axis of evil. Yeah. And you sort of think, are we actually masters of our own destiny here?
Well, earlier you asked me what it would be like to be the Russian Air Force chief. I'm now going to imagine I'm Putin. If I'm Putin, I've got a little top 10 list of jobs to do pinned on my screen. And the first few would be to rubbish international institutions like the UN and NATO. Drive a divide between the nations in them, make them look impotent, make them undecided, make them doubt whether they can take certain actions. The same with rules of engagement for weapons, etc. Putin is absolutely pulling the strings here. And there comes a point when we've got to stop him pulling the strings, and we need to start pulling the strings. And we keep missing the opportunity to do that.
A little while ago, we talked about deterrence, the ability to, create caution in your opponent. What actually happened? I mean, we read it in the newspaper and everybody, gets scared in the country. In terms of the people who are going to actually make the decisions, do we do this thing or do we not do it? Or do we half do it? Because we're now worried about what the other party might do. So I remember when Obama was president, he threatened Assad in Syria, if you spill chemical weapons on your own people, then we're going to go for you. That's my line in the sand. Yeah, he did, and Obama backed off. Trump came into power, by the way. Same thing happened. He got 50 cruise missiles up his backside. But for Obama not to do it, this is quite a big thing. So, how is that decision made militarily when you feel this deterrent issue on the table? Who gets together and?
Deterrent is a hugely complex subject, which we could probably spend all day discussing the theory, although I would quickly exhaust my mental capacity. Ultimately, it's about putting up an action that to the other side is too painful for them to take the risk of doing what they want to do. So it has to be something, not only does it set a line of what we don't accept as behavior, it's the consequences of you making that decision is going to be so horrific, you are not going to make it. If you are being bombed anyway and you don't think that another bomb here or there is going to make much difference, then you're not really going to pay much attention. And so it's both about setting that red line, whatever that red line might be. So NATO is a classic example. The NATO Article 5 is a very simple concept. An attack on one is an attack on all. You cross that line by 1 inch, that's it. Now, everyone will have to agree that 1 inch was indeed an attack. But at that point, it's everybody in. In fact, I was watching a documentary the other day about the British Lions tour to South Africa in 1974. And they had a call that was called the 99 call, that if one guy got punched, everyone was just going to turn around and punch the guy next to him. If you like, that's what a NATO Article 5 is. And it is so absolute, it is not worth Russia's risk, therefore, of even trying to see whether you meant it or not. When you start talking about actions like Syria and you start putting qualifications on it, you start to give somebody the idea that, actually, I might get away with this. And if you remember, that particular strike was actually a UK, French and US joint strike. I know because I was in my job at the time, and the UK Parliament had a long debate about whether it would or wouldn't act. And if you remember, we decided not to. So actually, it was the UK that pulled out of that the first time round.
Okay.
Because we decided that strikes in Syria were not appropriate. Now,
But it was Obama who said, "This is the line in the sand."
yeah, it was. And I think that's sometimes there is a danger that in a coalition of the willing, have you actually signed a memorandum that agreed that was going to be the joint red line? Or is that just your red line and now you want me to take part in your campaign?
Yeah.
Really tricky. I think with NATO, it's a lot more solidified because it's an agreement, it's a treaty. I think when you start doing, operations other than war in places like Syria or Libya, it gets a little bit trickier.
Yeah.
Can I also ask, and on the F-16 front, one of the things that, so we've recently taken delivery of the Lightning II Joint Strike Fighter. If we want to get UK weapons on that, you wait for 5 years, you pay a hell of a lot of money and whatever. The F-16s come with a load of, they're already cleared for weapons, but also not cleared for loads of weapons. But it's almost certain that the Ukrainians won't care about that. No. These things are going to get thrown on quickly. Given that Russia won't know what the capability is, have you got any comment on how quickly some of this stuff is going to get thrown onto aircraft, which we can't do in the West because of safety regulations, but they're in the middle of a war of survival, national survival, that actually people are just bolting stuff on and seeing if it works. What's the worst that can happen? The jet comes down.
Yeah. So you raised some really good points there. There's sort of a couple of issues, I think, with weapons and safety aspects. You're absolutely right that when you're in a wartime scenario, a lot of those peacetime safety breaks go out the window. You don't want your aeroplanes exploding spontaneously because you've made a mistake with your weapon integration, but as long as it's safe enough, then quite frankly, I don't need the bells and whistles. So if you look at the fences that we fitted the Storm Shadows to, that was done in weeks for small digit numbers of millions of dollars. When we did it on the Typhoon, it took us nearly 10 years and took us quite a lot of tens of millions of dollars. So, and clearly, therefore, you can do this quicker and cheaper. And I'm absolutely sure that once Ukraine take ownership of these F-16s, they'll do that. Now, we don't know what qualifications come with these aeroplanes. Has somebody written, you shall not do this, that, and the other? We'll have to wait and see how that plays out. But we've fitted Storm Shadows to their other aircraft type. Why would we not do it to an F-16? The one thing you need to realise, however, an F-16 is not a big aeroplane. So strapping on some of these really big systems is not easy physically, so that's something they'll have to look at.
I guess where my head was going though was that you and I both know there's lots of programs around that have things like directed energy weapons or stuff like that, stuff that isn't necessarily fielded at the moment because actually it hasn't been through the full safety case and stuff like that. I wonder whether, given Ukraine's challenge on the battlefield, whether actually they might, in the same way with drone technology, they're just throwing things together and having a go.
Yeah.
Whether there's the potential to do that with
the
F-16
I think they will. I mean, we've seen plenty of innovation in Ukraine. I mean, quite frankly, the most innovation has come from just operating so many different types that we would have spent years training to get to understand, and they've done it in weeks. So it's been impressive to see them absorb all this new technology, new systems, learn how to use them, and put them into combat. There's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't bring in the newer systems. In fact, in many ways, a lot of people will be looking at this as a bit of a laboratory. Why not test some of these systems? I think directed energy, we're a little bit way off on that from aircraft. It's generating the amount of power you need to get the ranges you need is still way beyond physics on that size of an aeroplane. But I absolutely think they will try to put some of these.
Yeah, the reason I'm mentioning direct energy is I'm absolutely with you. People talk about 5 years time, and there's all sorts of issues with lasers or whatever. Yeah. But, and there's a big but, given the number of drones, relatively slow speed drones that Russia's firing, and they're going deep within Ukraine, it might well be, therefore, that some of the weapons that are around that need, they have the reduced power, but actually they have to control their targeting for 10 seconds. Well, they have that time in Ukraine, which they wouldn't necessarily. That goes back to this test bed type idea that.
No, in the counter drone sense, you're absolutely right. I mean, why not try everything and anything? I mean, interestingly, we are seeing pretty much everything. Whether it's somebody shooting out the side of a yak with a shotgun, or people now buying more and more 20mm, surface to air guns, just to shoot a drone out of the sky. And yeah, we're now seeing some of the systems you and I remember that we thought had their day because their ranges were too short. They're perfect to shoot down drones.